Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, Bridging Conservation and Risk Reduction, Opportunities for Special Districts to Engage in Local Hazard Mitigation Planning. My name is Journey Lipscomb, and I'm a research associate here at the Environmental Law Institute. We're so delighted to see you all here today. If you're not familiar with ELI, just for a little bit of background, we are an internationally recognized nonpartisan research, publishing, and education center working to strengthen environmental protection by improving law and governance worldwide. We have a great program in store for you today, but before we get started, I have just a couple of quick logistical notes. I first want to take a moment to thank all of our wonderful speakers. We have Rebecca, Matthew, Gabe, Brad, and Zachary, who have all taken the time out of their busy schedules to join us here today. You'll be able to find the PDFs of their PowerPoint slides throughout the webinar on the event webpage later, so we'll drop the link to that in the chat. Today's webinar will also be recorded, and that will be publicly available on the event page as well within a few business days of the program. We'll be saving time at the end of the webinar today for audience questions. Please submit any questions you have using Zoom's Q&A function. We encourage you to use the chat to share any observations, comments, and resources, but please do be aware that we'll be pulling discussion questions from the Q&A box. Now, I would like to introduce our fantastic moderator, Dr. Rebecca Kisslinger. Rebecca is the Senior Science and Policy Analyst at ELI and Director of our Wetlands Program. She leads ELI's work on climate resilience and hazard mitigation, where she focuses on advancing nature-based solutions by promoting partnerships among natural resource agencies and organizations and hazard mitigation planners, and building the capacity of communities to identify risks and vulnerabilities, plan for the future, and develop projects that build resilience and meet local needs. She also conducts research on local, state, and federal wetlands law, policy, and management, and has led projects on compensatory mitigation and practice, compensatory mitigation policy and practice, including studies focused on the state of stream compensatory mitigation, improving compensatory mitigation project review, and in-lieu fee implementation across the country. And with that, I will hand things over to you, Rebecca. Thank you all so much for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, Journey. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to you all for being here. We're really happy to have you today for our webinar on bridging conservation and risk reduction. We have a really stellar panel lined up for you today. As Journey said, my name is Rebecca Kisslinger. I'm the Senior Science and Policy Analyst at ELI. I direct our Wetlands Program. In our Wetlands Program, we provide timely, balanced information on wetland law, policy, science, and management through research, education, and convenings like today. So today we're going to focus on how you scale up the use of nature, natural infrastructure, nature-based strategies to provide risk reduction and hazard mitigation and community resilience benefits to communities. Specifically, we're going to talk about, as Journey mentioned, how we increase capacity to scale up those projects by building partnerships. And today, we're really focused on how you build partnerships among natural resource experts, conservation agencies, special districts, and risk reduction and hazard mitigation experts. We've been working, as Journey said, with partners and communities across the country for more than a decade to identify opportunities to expand the use of nature, conservation, restoration of wetlands and floodplains, natural infrastructure, as hazard mitigation strategies, and to facilitate coordination and collaboration among the agencies and organizations that work across those disciplines so that they can work more effectively together and find projects and implement projects that provide multiple benefits. So today we're specifically focused on how special districts like conservation districts, soil and water conservation districts, conservancy districts, they're called different things and do a range of activities, how those districts can be more engaged in hazard mitigation planning at the local level. We have an expert panel here today to provide information across hazard mitigation planning and the local hazard mitigation planning process and the benefits of districts participating in that process. We're going to highlight some case studies and practical examples of nature-based projects that align conservation and risk reduction priorities. And then we're going to talk about some funding strategies and financing strategies that have emerged from the integrated planning process. So we have a stellar panel today. First, we have Matthew West, the Mitigation Planning Supervisor at the Colorado Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. He's going to talk about local hazard mitigation planning and integrating special districts. Then we have Gabe Powers, the Director of Land Preservation and Natural Resources from the McHenry County Conservation District, and Brad Andresen, the Chief Ecologist and Horticulturalist at the Village of Algonquin in Illinois. And they're going to talk about a case study on nature-based solutions, the Nippersink watershed wetland and floodplain restorations. And then finally, we'll turn to Zach Kristen, resource economist at Equilibrium Economics, and he's going to talk about leveraging partnerships and tools to build sustainable programs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, Matt. Thank you for being here. And we'll hand you over the reins.
All right, thank you, Becky. And thank you, Journey and Sarah, for this opportunity to speak to such a large group about hazard mitigation planning and something that's really near and dear to my heart. Trying to integrate that into our special, well, integrating our special districts and our conservation districts into hazard mitigation planning, especially here in our state of Colorado. I'm going to walk you through what hazard mitigation planning is, understanding that a lot of you today don't really have a background in emergency management. And I don't know that a lot of you have even participated in hazard mitigation planning, either at the local or at the state level. So without further ado, my slides are going. There we go. Okay. So this slide, I present this slide at every planning workshop that we deliver across the state. Those planning workshops usually are directed towards an audience of emergency managers, folks who work in emergency management. And the slide really is intended to show how mitigation fits into the different phases of emergency management. For you today, I understand that many of you are not in emergency management and are mostly in conservation or other areas that touch mitigation, but are not necessarily in the emergency management process or emergency management phases. So with emergency management, we have preparedness, where we're preparing for bad things to happen. We have a response, which is when we're responding to bad things happening. We have recovery, which is when we're recovering from those bad things that happened. But mitigation, really, with this slide, it encompasses all of those phases, or it should extend throughout those phases. The reason being is that mitigation, our hazards are constantly changing, as we all know. Especially today, we're seeing changes with hazards. Changes to impacts of hazards, those durations of hazards, and intensity as well. And so in order to effectively mitigate against those hazards, we have to be thinking about it almost constantly. That becomes really difficult for folks who are focused on emergency management, who are focused on responding, who are focused on recovering. And a lot of times mitigation kind of tends to fall by the wayside as we're looking at those other two phases, or even three phases, if you include preparedness into the emergency management phases. So mitigation tends to reside with the emergency manager in a certain jurisdiction. It's mitigation funding often at the federal level comes through FEMA and is passed down through the State Office of Emergency Management, and then out to locals. So a lot of times mitigation talk can get kind of siloed into the emergency management realm. And this is a great opportunity to get mitigation out of that and more into the community and whole of state, whole of government kind of planning focus. For just just for kicks, I wanted to see how many people have experience in hazard mitigation planning. I don't know if you have the ability to give a thumbs up or anything like that. But if you can, just give a thumbs up. Let's see who has participated in hazard mitigation planning, either at the state or the local level where you are.
I might be able to put a comment in the chat too. Oh yeah, Some people are putting thumbs up in the chat.
There we go. We have some thumbs ups coming in. All right. So with the emergency management phases, as I mentioned, um, they can often get lost. The phases, excuse me, mitigation can often get lost in those phases. So I know the wheel on the left has some very small lettering on it. I don't want you to squint too hard at it. This just shows how natural hazard mitigation fits into, or actually how natural resources, protecting natural resources like our stream buffers, our wetlands, uh, natural land cover, how those fit into our drivers of change, which are our land management practices, climate, how the climate is changing, invasive species that are coming into your areas, any hydrologic alterations, dams, levees, etc., how those change your environment, and then the benefits that we see from hazard mitigation, preventing the loss of coastal coastlines, the loss of preventing massive rock falls, landslides, etc., from either damaging, injuring, even killing people. And then mitigation also plays a big part in the public health sector, and just people's everyday lives, the quality of life and happiness. So looking at the right side, we have FEMA's definition of mitigation, which is sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk from hazards. The reason we emphasize the long-term risk is that while there are mitigation practices that focus on short-term benefits such as sandbagging, or even larger barriers like that when we're responding to floods, um, building fire breaks when we're responding to wildfire. Those are oftentimes response done in the moment to respond to an incident. This is taking action. Mitigation, our big M definition, if you will, is taking action before those incidents happen, building those fire breaks before they happen. Maybe reinforcing stream barriers, or providing natural cover, or restoring wetlands to better manage flooding, stuff like that. All of those activities reduce future demand for and the rising costs of disaster response, which is increasing at a very fast rate, especially today. Diving a little further into the benefits of hazard mitigation, up at the top left, so we have a picture of a guy talking to a bunch of people. Well, that doesn't really do service to what we actually try to do with hazard mitigation, which is bringing everybody in the community together to identify your risk, to prioritize your actions, and focus on those actions that are going to benefit, have the biggest benefit, the greatest impact to those hazard risks that you face. It promotes building partnerships through bringing people in the community together to talk about hazards, talk about risks, and how to develop mitigation solutions to those hazards. And it also increases everybody's awareness of hazards and risk. Of course, down at the bottom right, it leads into cost-effective actions for risk reduction. I'm going to touch a little bit more on that with the next slide. There are several, I think one baseline study done in around 2019 showing that for every dollar spent on hazard mitigation, we save about $6 in future costs. Well, this slide, according to NOAA, that average is now up to $1 saves around $13 in future costs. As inflation is going right now, that could have changed already as I was talking. But there are direct and very valuable benefits to hazard mitigation. Not just saving lives, but also saving money, saving resources, And I say not just saving lives, but that is the biggest one that we're looking at with mitigation is saving lives. So maybe I should have said that in the reverse order. So what is hazard mitigation planning? What do we do when we are planning to mitigate hazards that we face in our area? Well, first we bring together the government. That building at the top there kind of depicts the county or local government, who oftentimes runs or drives the mitigation planning train, if you will, for that jurisdiction. We also bring together people in the public. Um, try to get as many people as are interested in participating to participate, to express what their risks are, what their concerns are, so that we aren't just looking at it from a government perspective. On the right side of the screen, at the top there, those icons kind of depict all the special districts that we try to bring in as well. The water districts, the fire protection districts, the conservation districts. Here in Colorado, we have a rural electric association that participates in our state plan and thereby covers all of our smaller rural electric associations with their mitigation plans. So all of those are potential participants in hazard mitigation planning. We bring those people together. We identify the risks and vulnerabilities both through our modern day technology, such as ArcGIS, looking at specific hazards, looking at what has happened over the last 5 years since the previous mitigation plan went into effect, how those hazards have changed and how the risk may have changed, and also looking at vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities change throughout the hazard, the planning cycle, oftentimes by, unfortunately, people building in the way of hazards. So we identify those risks and vulnerabilities. We then develop long-term strategies working together to reduce or eliminate those impacts. So what that leads to is we have prioritized funding, especially today as federal funding is a little bit more in question. We have to, not that we shouldn't be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, but we have to, I think, better focus our spending, especially at the state and lower levels, around mitigation. So this helps prioritize that funding. It helps develop sustainable and resilient solutions that potentially cross jurisdictional boundaries. It helps break the disaster cycle and thereby reduces loss of life and property. So a couple examples of how we are integrating special districts here in Colorado. I have a few that I'm gonna talk to you about. Jefferson is in a pretty advanced phase of their mitigation planning and participation. Mile High Flood District is just starting out, and the Arkansas Basin is something that we're in talks of. So kind of different phases of participation where they're at today. Looking first at Jefferson Conservation District. In the middle of the screen there's a map of Colorado. That red portion is Jefferson County. You can see it's on the west side of what is the Denver metro area. And that blown up map there is Jefferson County itself. The conservation district's jurisdiction, just extends just slightly outside of the county's jurisdiction, actually includes some of the communities that are in neighboring Park County to the west there, Clear Creek County, Gilpin County. That's critical because Jefferson County participated in Jefferson Conservation District participated in Jefferson County's last hazard mitigation plan, thereby became eligible to apply for and receive FEMA mitigation funding. They applied for funding. They received an award for a project for wildfire mitigation. that project at a total cost is just slightly over $7.5 million. So the federal share of that project, the portion that the federal FEMA is going to pay, is just under 6 million of that. So now we have about 1.5 million left. The state agreed to match just over $800,000 of that of the remaining amount, which leaves Jefferson Conservation District with just over $750,000 that they have to come up with as their portion of the share. This is a fairly large, encompasses the entire county. It's a wildfire fuels reduction project. And I mentioned that, you know, their jurisdiction allows them to extend a little bit outside of the county jurisdiction. They cover some of those, some small communities in neighboring counties, and they're able to conduct wildfire mitigation outside of those, outside of Jefferson County and in those communities. So those communities do benefit even though they're not physically in Jefferson County. Next, looking at the Mile High Flood District. This was a recent win for us. So the Mile High Flood District, if you look at the map on the left, is largely covers the Denver metropolitan area here in Colorado. There's lots of pretty colors on that map. Each one represents a different region that has been kind of broken down. But if you look past those colors, there are, I think, 8 counties represented on that map, numerous incorporated cities, towns, etc. I can't even tell you how many actual government entities are in that map on the screen. If you look over on the right side, you see how Mile High Flood District's jurisdiction it essentially covers all of that area. You can see the boundary in the background of kind of the Denver International Airport up there in the northeast corner of that map, and then all the way down again to Jefferson County in the southwest. So they have a very, very large jurisdiction, and they have agreed to participate in Jefferson County's upcoming hazard mitigation plan update. By participating in that plan, in that one plan, although their jurisdiction extends well beyond Jefferson County, they will be eligible once that plan is approved to apply for funding for mitigation projects that extend across their entire jurisdiction. So they could potentially have a project that extends from the northwest up in Boulder County all the way down through the city and county of Denver, and then into either Arapahoe County down in the southeast, or even down into Douglas County down in the southeast. So huge potential for very big mitigation projects that can have very big impacts across the entire Denver metro area. Instead of trying to piecemeal together numerous smaller jurisdiction projects to make the one big project. Okay, finally, I'm going to talk about the Upper Arkansas River Basin. This hasn't even really gotten off the ground yet, but it's a project, or at least it's something that we're really excited about, at least in our mitigation section here in Colorado. So the Upper Arkansas River Basin, if you look at that map, the headwaters are up near the 2 red triangles that are in the northwest corner of the map, or in the upper left corner of the map. Those are in somewhere around Lake County. Anyways, in our Rocky Mountains here in Colorado, the Upper Arkansas then comes through from Lake down into the Pueblo area, and then out onto the Eastern Plains. And what they're having difficulty with, or problems with, is as the water comes down and through several communities, several maybe non-natural water bodies, etc., it's picking up a lot of sedimentation and depositing it further downstream in the upper Arkansas River Basin. It's causing problems. So in the southeast corner of the state, which is on that map, bordering Kansas, also Oklahoma, Texas, and then New Mexico over to the western portion. It's depositing a lot of sand in our highly agricultural focused areas, which requires annual dredging so that they can successfully pull the water that they need from the river to water their crops and grow their agriculture. It's an annual cost of about $1 million to dredge the river. And it's a constant burden for agricultural producers, and it's as you can imagine, leading to widespread problems just in the basin. You know, the natural resources are struggling given the annual dredging and the problems that it's bringing up. So as you can see on this map, the Arkansas River Basin extends across several states. We were approached by Ducks Unlimited, which is working in Colorado. They also have representatives in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. They are working on the entire upper Arkansas River Basin as a whole, trying to bring these states who are in the basin into the overall planning process to improve the quality of the upper Arkansas River Basin. They approached us. There is a representative in Oklahoma working directly with Ducks Unlimited, one in Kansas as well. But if you look at Colorado, so we have our southeast portion of the state primarily as the upper Arkansas River Basin. I've overlaid a county map of Colorado over our portion of the basin. As you can see there, pretty much starting from Pueblo in the middle of the map, there are about 8 or 9 counties just in that basin. So Ducks Unlimited approached us. We are working with our field manager in the southeast to get Ducks Unlimited into the Southeast region's hazard mitigation plan as a stakeholder who they can then start talking to conservation districts, counties in the Southeast about improving the Arkansas River Basin. This is can be a little more difficult, especially out in rural areas. For us, the Southeast, actually our entire Eastern Plains are considered very rural, and for those areas, outsiders can oftentimes hit roadblocks when trying to establish relationships with locals. You know, folks from the outside often aren't very welcomed in, and so even those of us, when we go out with our DHSEM, Colorado DHSEM logos on our shirt, we can hit some resistance. We can hit some you know, some folks who aren't too happy with what the state does. So working through our field manager who lives in the Southeast, we're able to get an organization like Ducks Unlimited, who is very heavily focused on wetland conservation and getting access to hunters to continue those hunting activities. They are now able to address a much bigger problem, which is the upper Arkansas River Basin, or they're working towards that. So again, very, very excited about what that could potentially bring. So bringing it all together, what is hazard mitigation planning? It's really a community-wide effort, trying to get as many folks who are interested to be involved. And I will say that I try to drum up as much interest as possible so that folks will be involved, because it's near and dear to my heart. Very tangible results with hazard mitigation planning. we saw that, not only does it save lives, or not only does it save money, but it saves lives and property as well. And it can benefit everybody if done in a comprehensive planning state. So a little information there on how you can get involved if you're not really too sure. I would just say reach out to your local or county emergency manager if you have any questions. And with that, I don't know if we have time right now. I know that we have discussions and answers at the end, so.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I hope I'm getting weird messages. Thank you so much, Matt, for that. As we switch over to Gabe and Brad, I'll just remind folks to put questions in the question box. But I just wanted to say, Matt, I really appreciate the emphasis on the benefits of bringing in the districts to the hazard mitigation planning process, on flood and sediment and the scale at which they can work too. And as we're changing over, I was wondering if you could just say a few words on, and I appreciate the last slide where it says, how some information on how folks could get involved, but can you give us just a few words on the genesis of like the Jefferson County Conservation District? Where did they come to the planners first? Did the planners go to them first? Like, how did that get established, that partnership?
Becky, I'll be completely honest. I wasn't here when that relationship was established. I did look at the registration list, and one of the registered participants used to be the Jeffco emergency manager.
Oh, put it in the chat if you know. That would be awesome. Yeah, I just wanted for more information for people, like how those partnerships get started, I think is super interesting. So thank you again, Matt. That was really, really great. And
yeah,
Gabe,
absolutely. For our other county, I can say, like, we actively try to we talk to our emergency managers about the importance of bringing in the special districts. We go to our conservation focused conferences around the state, our watershed conferences. In fact, Jason, my coworker, is going to one, I think, next week to deliver a similar presentation that I'm giving today. So we try to get out, and we try to make our emergency managers reach out as well.
That's great. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. And I'm sure we'll have more questions. There were a few in the chat already, so we'll get to those at the end. Gabe.
Are you seeing my screen okay?
Not yet.
No, uh-oh.
Maybe Sarah has to share. Oh, maybe. Here we go. Coming now.
There we go.
Yep.
Good.
Perfect.
All right. Well, good afternoon from Illinois. I guess it's good morning on the West Coast still, but my name is Gabe Powers, and I'm currently serving as the Director of Land Preservation and Natural Resources for the McHenry County Conservation District, a special district in the state of Illinois. And today I'm going to highlight nature-based solution projects in the Nippersink watershed. And these co-benefits of these ecological restoration projects help flood mitigation. For my FEMA and IEMA folks, our hazard mitigation risk scores, the highest ones are floods and severe summer storms. So that's important to McHenry County. The word Nippersink means a place of small waters, and that is a word from the Anishinaabe people, and also known as the Potawatomi. And we believe that small waters is referencing the many springs or groundwater discharge in the area and the region is known for through the glaciation process, which we'll talk a little bit about here today. Other indigenous groups that are known to have called this area their traditional homeland include the Ho-Chunk, Kickapoo, Lakota, Dakota, Mascoutin, Miami, Peoria, Sauk, and Meskwaki peoples. In Illinois, we have two different types of natural resource focused special districts. Those are the conservation districts and forest reserve districts. And here's just a map of where they exist. So it's not all throughout Illinois, but certainly a good representation in the Chicagoland area there. And this was brought forward by the modern United States environmental movement and the Conservation District Act of 1963 that allowed this organization of the special district, which with that legislation and a group of conscientious environmentalist groups established the Conservation District of McHenry County in 1971. In 1978, there was a statewide natural areas inventory, and that was assessing all of the state's land holdings to see what natural heritage still existed. And in 1978, this study showed that only 7/100ths of 1% of the state's land and water resources qualified as relatively undisturbed. So conversely, that means that 99.993% has been impacted by man. And that really just shows that we have a fantastic opportunity to employ these nature-based solutions to address hazard mitigation through ecological restoration in our county and state. So today I'm going to cover a little bit of the history that led up to some of our ecological restoration projects to illustrate our watershed approach here at the Conservation District. Near the end, I'll have some financial slides for those that are interested in funding these types of projects, a few that have different funding mechanisms as well. And because I often hear in response to my presentation that we can't do these types of projects because we're not a special district, I have one of our partners, Brad Andresen, who's the chief ecologist with the village of Algonquin, and they have some phenomenal nature-based solution practices that they have employed in their jurisdiction as well. So if you're a part of society, your voice is needed in hazard mitigation planning, even if it's at that planning stage where we're evaluating development type projects. So as with any story, we need to start at the beginning, and long before we had conservation districts or people on the land, we were covered in water. In our part of Illinois, that water was frozen, and we're talking glaciers. So a little bit of imagery there shows how glaciers move, some of that till, that glacial till, and specifically to the project that I'm going to be covering, we're talking about a came. So right there in the bottom left, you can kind of see what a came looks like, but essentially just imagine a hill of glacial till, and that glacial till is highly permeable. So as the groundwater filters through that glacial till, that's where some of these springs really show up in our region. So they'll be infiltration and then discharge, groundwater discharge, creating springs and those small waters that the Potawatomi people named the region for. Some of the ecological forces that are in play or were in play prior to European development, fire, all of our systems, I should say the majority of our systems in McHenry County and throughout Illinois are fire dependent systems. In the center there you can see that's an oak savanna, globally rare resource that we are managing, but fire dependent system. The picture on the top is actually from Canada, but it shows the ecosystem engineer, the beaver, and their impact on water resources. And if you imagine these animals on the landscape, they're certainly impacting how those streams move over time and certainly connecting streams to their floodplain. So when we get to some of the air photos, just imagine what a beavered landscape would look like. This is one of our planning resources that we really like to use when we're doing any type of ecological restoration. This is the 1872 plat book. And a couple features on here that I want to call out. First, the springs. I kind of mentioned that place of small waters. There's a lot of springs in this area, groundwater discharge. And then the cames. I talked about that with the glaciation. This is illustrating the came features in that floodplain. And that's going to be an important component to our ecological restoration project. I included this slide. This is the 1837 plat. So this is the original survey, prior to European development, where they went through, surveyed all the land, and started to describe what was there. And I'm just going to read real quick a couple statements from the original survey. So the Nippersink Creek is 50 lengths wide. So that's 33 feet or 10 meters if you're doing the calculation. Clear water. Overflowed south side to depth of 12 inches as appears by the grass. So that's really talking about the floodplain there. And then they do a lot of description of the land. Land unfit for cultivation. Prairie too wet and too swampy. Prairie not fit for cultivation. Nearly all covered with water. So before European development, Illinois was very wet. But in order to make this land productive, we really needed to lower those waters, and drainage began across the state. There was lots of ditches that were excavated. All of our streams, not all of them, a lot of our streams were straightened, especially those headwater streams, in order to lower that water table and make these lands productive. Waters were straightened, and then flows were expedited. And then all of our headwater streams, at least in this region, I say all, but vast majority of them were placed underground in tiles. So entire streams were placed underground through the tiling system. The Wetlands Initiative estimates that in 1935, there was enough tile installed in the state of Illinois to go around the globe 6 times. So we're talking about a lot of drainage that has occurred in the state of Illinois. What they're trying to do is focus all that flow into that main channel, tile those other systems, and then in ecological restoration, we're doing the opposite. We're going to restore the hydrology, reconnect those streams to their floodplains, and allow a place for those floodwaters to go, which we do it for ecological purposes, but the co-benefit is flood mitigation, and downstream neighbors have commented that they've seen flood mitigation from our ecological restoration projects. So this is going to go through the Nippersink project. It's in 5 different phases over time since 1999, and then we're currently finishing the last phase right now. But in 1954, from this air photo, the green here is where we put the stream back, but you can see where it was ditched on the left side of the screen there. So well drained, and you can kind of see where those kames were mined. They took the kamic material and used it for roads. They also would place it in the ditches the old stream in the winter, and then when the ice melted, it filled the stream. And then you can see this large drainage ditch here as well, which I have a photo of before restoration. But the benefit to society with all this drainage was we are really good at growing agricultural products in the state of Illinois, and primarily corn and soybeans. A lot of agriculture products benefit society. Some of the negative externalities with that accounting equation is our impacts to water quantity in Illinois, specifically to McHenry County. We're outside of the Great Lakes watershed, the Great Lakes Water Pact. So we're solely reliant on groundwater and groundwater recharge. So that water quantity is very important to our society. Obviously, we lost a lot of flood storage with that massive amount of draining of the landscape, water supply issues for those streams, which directly link to biodiversity, and then also water quality and overall biodiversity, both land and water, along with wildlife habitat, have been negative externalities that we try to internalize through the taxpayer funding to the conservation district. This is a picture of the project before restoration. So you can see those suspended solids in the stream, very dirty stream, tile outflow right there. The other thing with these ditch systems, very flashy. So whenever you have a flood, it'll come up very quick and impact resources. When I say resources, human assets, if you will, that were constructed in the former floodplain, and financial loss associated with those. This is the ditch. And for my Clean Water Act folks, that is nothing that you want to fish or swim in. So that is pre-restoration. In 1939, the stream channel of the Nippersink was still in place. And as I alluded to earlier, you can kind of see all those features in the center of the valley there, and just kind of imagine what the beaver did to that landscape and move that stream back and forth. But what we're doing here for ecological purposes is putting the stream back to its original channel and allowing these systems to function while providing those flood mitigation benefits. 1987, this just shows where the ditches were placed and the stream ditch here on the west. You kind of see a little hint of the former channel. So that former channel is really what gave us our guide for the restoration project. This is the last before picture I have for you. We can see the mining of the Kame and where that signature of the old channel was. So in order to put it back, we first started to construct the new channel, got rid of the fill, and you again used those air photos to figure out where that channel was, and then did some coring as well. Connecting the floodplain, so we have a creek that is connected to a floodplain, can get out of its banks in those flood events. If you can work in the dry, it's good. So that's the best way to do an ecological restoration project, but sometimes you need to work in the wet. And here you can see we're grading back the banks while the stream is still flowing. This is phase 2 of the project. This is us rebuilding that came. I mentioned the came. Nice part about the came is a lot of the came is outside the floodplain. So for a comp storage situation, that helped us out quite a bit. The only negative part is, yes, this is ecological restoration by form, but those soils do not function the same way as kamic soils do. You actually can see the vegetation barrier between the remnant kame and the reconstructed kame. But it is good for this type of ecological restoration project. This is us removing tiles. So we're restoring the hydrology. We're getting rid of all the drainage features. So the hydrologic regime is functioning as a system. Whenever we pull back those banks, we'll place native vegetation and use a lot of matting with this. The first 3 phases of this project, we laid 22 miles of erosion mat in order to protect the soil and get plants growing. This is probably my favorite photo because we often hear in these ecological spheres that people don't care, and I guarantee you they do care. And this photo shows that this is people coming out to rescue mussels, so aquatic organisms that would have dried out once we rediverted the water, and they came out, collected mussels, and moved them back into the new stream. We even had people show up the next day. We had the organized day, but they couldn't sleep because they wanted to make sure that all the mussels got picked up. This is the after photo of the remeandering, the major section, phase 1. Just shows the new channel. You can kind of see where we moved and our cycling for restoring that the project, the stream there. This shows the first 3 phases of the project from the air. The first phase I mentioned previously, we were able to construct that in the dry, and then phase 2 and 3 we had to do with the stream flowing. When you think of ecological restoration, it's really important to take a watershed approach. And I put this slide in just so you can see all the different projects. I'm highlighting just the Nippersink restoration, but this really is a much larger watershed approach. And that's important when we're talking about hazard mitigation planning. They take these watershed approaches because each watershed is going to be different and each solution is going to have a different path to get there. But this just shows all the different efforts that have taken place over the last 30-ish years in the glacial park portion of the Nippersink watershed. And then if you look at the high level, the yellow on the left shows all the tile removals that we have done associated with those projects. And the blue in the center is all the hydric soils. So if you take a look at all of the wetlands that have been restored, we're approximately 2,000 acres in this valley. And according to EPA calculations associated with those wetland storage, around 2 billion acres of co-benefited from a flood storage capacity. This is a quick photo to show you how quickly the water will return to the land and start storing waters when you remove tiles. This is the figures for folks if you're interested in how much it costs. The one caveat for this one, these are 1999 and 2000 numbers, so take that with what it is. But cost us, we did this project in-house, $732,000 back then. You can see in the lower left, this is what we actually did. So 10,000 feet of remeander, 5,200 feet of grading. We placed 1,100 tons of rock in order to check that stream and make sure that it wouldn't downcut and allow that stream to function with its floodplain. And then rebuilt the came and removed 65,000 cubic yards of material. This is phase 4 of the ecological restoration of the Nippersink, and this was a federal project. So this is through Section 206 funding, aquatic ecosystem restoration and preservation. So we installed 7 riffles, again, in order to connect that stream to its floodplain, did some bank grading as well, restored another came, so hauled all that material out of the floodplain to restore another came. And then it also included 550 acres of ecological enhancement. And you can see the figures down there in the bottom, 4.9 from the federal match, and then the conservation district land match there at 2.6 million. Another creative opportunity if you're looking to fund these projects and have an ecological restoration group. You can do wetland mitigation. There's also private groups that do wetland mitigation, but you can kind of identify areas on the landscape where there could be good opportunities for ecological restoration. On the left is our engineering for this project. On the right is the first winter after the restoration. So you can see all the tile scars that were removed, and then the stream restoration. And this is actually a mitigation bank. So 404 Clean Water Act public bank where we sell wetland credits. These are the figures for that bank. To date, we're around 585,000 of expenditures. We've sold $1 million worth of credits and have additional resources coming in, financial resources coming in once we meet performance standards. So potential another $3 million associated with that project that will be used for additional ecological restoration. I just want to, before we move to Brad, talk about these forces. And in this case, we were denied a permit because up here to the north, the county was concerned about flooding offsite impacts. Well, the federal government ended up buying that, and they were supportive of that. So we actually had beavers restore this one for us, and they placed a dam right where I was planning on placing a riffle with a under drain. So you can have ecological restoration take place just by allowing these systems and enough land for those resources to do their thing. So in this case, the beaver dam's right about here. And yes, it is a lake restoration, but when in a flooding situation, we have storage in all of the land around that. So the beavers are actually connecting the stream to the floodplain in that situation. Go ahead, Brad.
All right. Thank you, Gabe. I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk really quick about taking this watershed scale approach and how we've applied it within the village of Algonquin. The village of Algonquin is a medium-sized town, mostly within McHenry County in Illinois. We have about 30,000 residents, and we have three main watersheds within our town. The biggest one being the Woods Creek watershed. And about 12 years ago, we had a watershed plan created for the area. What you're seeing on the screen is the action item list of the watershed plan. And we have worked over the past 15 to 20 years to systematically restore sections of the creek to help increase flood storage and do some hazard mitigation. At the downstream end of Woods Creek, where this flows into the Fox River, we have a park and it runs right through our downtown area. During the 70s and 80s and early 90s, we had quite a bit of flooding, as Gabe was saying. These systems that are mostly based off of agricultural drain tile tend to be very flashy. We even had one fatality in the stream during a flooding event in the 1980s. So we focused in the start of our ecological restoration plans within the village of Algonquin on the Woods Creek watershed. And over the past 12 years, we have completed a total of 8 stream restoration projects within the watershed. Gabe, you can go ahead and flip through showing some of the areas that we've completed. Go ahead and move on to the next one. We've got another reach currently right now designed and permitted. And we've actually applied for an EPA 319 grant. So fingers crossed that we get that awarded and can construct that next year. And then we have a couple of other reaches that are further downstream that are future projects for the village of Algonquin. And over those years, we've actually seen a massive reduction in flooding, particularly in the park areas at the downstream section of Woods Creek. So we have seen a very tangible benefit just in flood mitigation from these upstream ecological restoration projects that we've completed in town. Go ahead and move on to the next slide. Another thing that the village of Algonquin has spent a lot of time doing is working directly with developers. We are on the outskirts of the suburban and urban interface for kind of the suburban growth in the Chicago metropolitan area. So we have a lot of subdivision development within town, and we use the watershed plans and mark areas within town as priority areas for green infrastructure or for conservation design. Since the watershed plan was implemented and adopted by our village board. We have actually codified the requirements for conservation design, and we use that when working with developers as they bring developments into town. On the screen is a quick example of a golf course that went out of business, was purchased by a developer. It was marked in our watershed plan as a green infrastructure area and a development that should follow conservation design principles. We worked directly with the developer during the concept phase and construction phase of the project to be able to move all the stormwater detention areas into contiguous green infrastructure corridors. And then the developer paid to restore these to our specifications. Once completed and established, the nearly 40 acres of green infrastructure were donated to the village, and I am now managing them along with the other 500 acres within town as part of our larger green infrastructure network. So it is possible, it takes a lot of work, but it is possible to work directly with developers to help build in this green infrastructure as it's being developed, rather than having to go and retrofit poor development as it comes into your jurisdiction areas. Gabe, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you.
Absolutely. Looks like I'm hung up here. Oh, there we go. So this is our final slide, and I did see a question in the chat that was talking about tiles. So a tile is a just imagine kind of like a straw placed underground that is going to convey water. So as the groundwater increases, you have a perforated tile. So it has holes in the side, and prior to them being plastic, they were concrete. So there was gaps between each tile, and the groundwater would come up, and then the tile flows, the water flows through the tile to a downstream point. So what tiling did is it lowered the water table and allowed all of those wetlands and those streams and the headwater streams anyways to be placed underground, which allowed those wetland soils to grow crops. So that's what a tile is. But my final slide here is for everyone. If you're part of society, which we all are, I just encourage you to be involved in hazard mitigation planning. As Brad alluded to, this planning phase is not easy, but it is probably the most important because it's so difficult to undo when we cut up these systems and place property lines all over the place to have them function for us. So dream big and provide hope for small waters. And I understand I have a little bit more time to show the final phase here. So I'm going to convert over. And if there's any other questions you want to hit while I'm doing this, Brad, you certainly can.
I was just going to jump in to say, thank you, Brad. I really love that example of how the watershed plan is integrated into the zoning and how then that, makes sure that the green infrastructure is planned ahead of time. And then that management goes back to you. It's just such a really great example. And I appreciate you bringing it to. Okay. Gabe.
Can you see the arrow? Okay. So if you look to the top of the picture here, this is the Nipper Sink, right there where that bridge was. This is the original channel. So everything to the left was the meander. And then if you drew a straight line, can you see my cursor?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you drew a straight line right about here, this is where the old ditch ran. So if you remember those air photos, this was the old ditch. So you can see we've filled all this, but we could not do this final phase because there was private land to the north, which you'll see. But one of our external partners purchased that property, and they are working with the Friends of Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge to do a restoration to the north of us. But you can see that this is us filling that final ditch. But anyway, they got funding through congressional funding, Senator Underwood, $900,000 to do their side, which I have that video as well. Oh no. I gotta redo this here now. Hit the wrong click. You see that?
Yep. Got it.
Okay, so this is the final. So we completed this. The first one was in process. You can see we put a little riffle right here, so that's going to control your water level. And then you can see the remeandered stream, and then to the left here is where that former ditch was. We filled the ditch. These are egrets, so the water, once it comes back, will flow into this little riparian wetland. This is Nippersink Creek right here. And then to the north is the project that I alluded to that partners are doing. So they have their ditch check. So this is a drainage ditch. I have one more video that will show this, but this is controlling the water level right there. And this is their project. So our project's right here in the bottom. Just did, sorry. I guess I don't have theirs. I thought I did.
How big is the total project?
Ours was about 8 acres, but theirs. Theirs is about they have, here we go. Sorry, I was clicking on the wrong one. Theirs was probably 150 total acres, and as we go over here, I can explain it. So this is where the stream is being reconnected to the floodplain. So they have a grade control riffle right there. There's another grade control riffle right there. So that's allowing the stream to interact with all of these hydric soils. You can see right there is some tile removals. All these little scars, those are drainage tile removals. And then all the way up filled in this farmer ditch. So now all of this land is now a flood mitigation and ecological restoration at that area. So it's a stream restoration, wetland restoration, but also has the co-benefit of flood mitigation.
Well,
And this is happening right now in Northern Illinois.
that's great. Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing these videos. And we'll have some more questions at the end, and maybe we can talk a little bit about challenges around getting willing landowners alluded to. But we're going to move now to Zach for our final presentation.
All right, can folks hear me well?
Yep, gotcha.
All right, thanks everyone. My name is Zachary Kristen. I am with Equilibrium Economics, and a firm that works with multiple municipalities, research conservation districts, among others, to understand the benefits associated with projects they're doing, especially from an economics perspective, with really aiming at policy for this. So I'm testing out the control here, so everything looks good. So let me advance to the next slide here. There we go. So my presentation should be a little shorter, and I'll give you an idea here of what I'm talking about in general. So you've heard a lot from these cases with projects, especially in the implementation stages or post-implementation stages. And the organizations I've worked with actually most often are the ones that are building things from the ground up. And they're asking questions about, how do I even engage, start hazard planning, mitigation projects, processes, who do I partner with, who are my stakeholders, and most importantly, how do they access and secure funding for such projects, especially when there's not a consistent funding mechanism, as we call it, or a stream of funding to support such projects. In my past, I've worked with multiple jurisdictions, which I'll highlight, particularly with a policy aimed near the end. And so what I mean by that could be anything from a policy, say, engaging our decision makers, whether if we're at the city or state level, our elected officials, to create a funding mechanism that may be more consistent. It's engaging with federal or state resources for those one-time funding injections, and even partnerships with local NGOs, and even in some cases private firms, where we're understanding how to collect money for those stakeholders who benefit from what a post-project could look like. And so what I'm highlighting today are many case studies where I'm trying to sample that, especially particularly focusing on municipalities and resource conservation districts, and also talking about the tools that we use and what it means in those partnership cases, which I've alluded to. So I will talk about 3 primary projects at a pretty high level. The first being based out of Santa Clara County. And just to briefly summarize the benefits associated with that project, Sorry, I'm clicking here just to make sure what I'm trying to animate pops up. So in short, that the multiple resource conservation districts came together to pass what is called Measure Q, or parcel tax, which created the funding mechanism to sustainably fund those resource conservation districts and gave them the tools to then work with multiple partners. I imagine even many people who were even associated with the call and register today. I saw a couple of familiar organizations and names to work and with sustainable funding on several projects. And I'll get into those in a little bit more detail a little later. The second project in the middle is focused on the city of Snoqualmie in Washington State. I saw many Washington folks registered as well. Still trying to get this thing to go. There it goes. So one of their funding mechanisms was focused on surface water fees. So that was engaging the actual decision makers at the local level, their council, to pass a surface water fee, and using a portion of the revenue that came from that fee to then fund in the municipality a program that treated forests as assets and worked accordingly. And finally, I think many folks are familiar with FEMA and the BCA tool and the hazard mitigation grants, but I want to talk about that in light of the policies that have been come through, because we've seen time and time again, especially smaller jurisdictions, so little light shed on the availability and opportunity and even applicability of different types of projects toward accessing funding at the FEMA level. And yes, funding that still exists, and there are projects out there for them. I will stray away from bricks because I know that's a teetering topic at the moment. So that was a highlight of my case studies, which I'll talk about a little bit more in detail in a moment. And I just wanted to highlight a suite of tools. This is just a sampling of tools that I have used in my work with these organizations. And just to highlight them at a high level, and I can talk to them in more detail if there are questions related to them. We have a recreation model in-house where we understand the benefits of restoration from a recreation perspective. And so it's understanding the value that folks see and being able to restore habitat and to experience and access nature, both in urban contexts and in more rural contexts, to then again make that value proposition of what does this post-project circumstance look like, what kind of habitat are we creating, what kind of opportunities are we creating for people to experience nature, and that's deriving monetary values to do so. In some cases, say a state government or municipality has their own, say, goals toward carbon, and that could be a carbon neutrality goal, it could be many things. But then at the same time, you're seeing capital infrastructure bills or capital infrastructure budgets that are going through that kind of negate the efforts that they're trying to do. And so we work with municipalities to understand the value of some of, say, a mitigation project that will benefit from a carbon sequestration perspective. What's the monetary value of that, and how does it actually impact the broader portfolio of those goals? And then finally, we have a tool called VEGS. It's a valuation of ecosystem goods and services, and it allows us to tackle many different ecosystem services, everything from what is the flood protection benefits associated with the mitigation project, what are the aesthetic benefits, so added value to property. And we use this database to understand and try to measure these things from a monetary perspective, because in the absence oftentimes of having a dollar value to help propose and support a project, you're faced against other gray infrastructure projects that can demonstrate sometimes these monetary values, and you don't understand those secondary benefits. So our end goal isn't monetization for the sake of doing so, but one, it's a valuable tool to help inform policy. So now let me get into the details of some of the case studies I alluded to before. So the California case study, and this is a conservation district of Santa Cruz, and this actually involved other conservation districts in the Bay Area, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But one of our goals in this project was understanding the water supply benefits of a lot of the projects undertaken by the conservation district, flood control benefits, and habitat benefits. And we compared this to a return on investment of an acquisition and restoration of one area within and adjacent to the conservation district proper lands that they helped maintain, called the Bocarisa. So what we understood was the maintenance costs associated with the restoration project itself the injection costs of like bringing in materials, bringing in restoration, it's very similar to the projects we've seen, not much in the way of tile removal, but more in the way of returning many streams and nearby riparian areas to a more stable state instead of the hardening that had been done before. And then the opportunity costs were some of the, say, the costs of being able to allow folks to, say, develop in the area, or there are other costs associated with that. But what we looked at was on the benefit side, the water supply benefits, the flood control, habitat benefits associated with that, to then calculate what was the return on investment of that acquisition and restoration project. So we were able to work with those partners to demonstrate that very quickly. Right after the implementation of the project, we would be able to see a return on investment of those benefits. And we're thinking something, say, as habitat, it's not impacting anybody's bottom line, but it's the benefits of the community that around the area that experience that. However, when we look at flood control benefits, in the event of a disaster such as a, say, 50, 100-year flood, we do see that that obviously impacts the communities nearby. And so we use some economic tools to understand what that value would and could be. So a quick highlight of a case study in California. I want to quickly talk to the community benefits and some of the partnerships. So this project was one called SC3 because it also partnered with, there was the Santa Clara Resource Conservation District, the Conservation District of Santa Clara County, nearby Santa Cruz, and also Sonoma County, just north. And so those three resource conservation districts represented those three counties came together to not only work with our team to justify the funding for the analysis and a lot of the data gathering we're doing, but also did the work and the communication and the stakeholder engagement associated with reaching out to policymakers to educate the community to work toward what ended up being the policy put forth called Measure Q. And that was one that I had talked about, and I'm talking about specifically in the Santa Cruz context. It was a parcel tax. It was something that had to be voted and approved. They had a 2/3 majority requirement just before and a parcel tax would be approved, and they barely met that threshold. They had about 68% of the community vote to approve this, and what that ended up resulting is about an 87 annual per parcel tax. So, to some community members, quite a hefty annual dollar increase, but it resulted in a sustainable funding mechanism year over year of $7.5 million. And that was something that now goes toward that conservation district for their efforts. So in the interest of time, I'm going to quickly go over to my next case study. This is back in Washington State, city of Snoqualmie. So this is east of Seattle, if you're following I-5 going out east. So the city of Snoqualmie is nested in the mountains right as you kind of come over the crest of the Cascades there. It's a recreation community. I used to live in Tacoma, Washington. I'm going to drive out east and we'll go through Snoqualmie all the time on my way to hike and recreate elsewhere. And the municipality, the city proper, they were interested in understanding the value of their forests in the city proper. And what they wanted to understand was what's the value of, say, stormwater retention. So we called it flood control in the prior project. Stormwater retention is essentially the same ecosystem services we talked about. They want to understand the carbon value because they had more general citywide carbon practices and goals. And they also want to understand the water quality because of the Wash River that runs right through the community there. But the project itself was to understand what the value of their forests provide, especially when they're in good health. And the purpose of that was to maintain them. I mean, these forests acted as assets to help from a stormwater retention benefit, from water quality, among other ecosystem services that we didn't focus on because the scope of our project couldn't necessarily get at that. But what we were able to demonstrate and then present to the city council was that each year, just for these three ecosystem services, the forests in the city proper generate about $5.8 to $7.3 million in those goods and services each year. And presenting this information, and we also in the report were able to look at case studies where, in the case where we develop a particular area, which was a proposed develop on a gentle slope, what will that impact be from a stormwater retention? So we're able to focus on those case studies and provide that benefit and cost argument to the folks to demonstrate what the value of the forest was. And so the result, again, this is a policy we're focusing on from the beginning, was an ordinance related to expanding the utility funded activities to include forest management. The community wanted to think of their forests like detention ponds, like other stormwater infrastructure as assets, and they can continue to fund it out of this utility funded bill rather than relying on injections and the susceptibility to the general fund. And so this, again, once they passed, it was a 9-person council with a unanimous approval of the effort itself, created a $4.7 to $5.7 million funding mechanism for the program. And that was something that didn't exist before. And again, the 1.5 FTE forestry department that led the work of maintaining the forests there relied on general fund to operate their services. So the last thing I want to mention is how was even the research associated with this was funded. So this is the city of Snoqualmie on the right side. It was actually funded by the King Conservation District. So the Conservation District was a key partner. And currently we're working with the city of Tukwila, which is down the slope, going west, right underneath Seattle, currently right now to do very similar work and focusing on key ecosystem services to understand their value and to help inform different policies, not a stormwater fee, but different policies for that particular municipality. So finally, I wanted to go to the highlight of hazard mitigation applications from the perspective. This is walking up to the federal government level out of the state and local municipality. So many of you are likely familiar with mitigation policy, maybe not by name, FP 108-02401, but this was in 2013, the policy that was passed that allowed FEMA to include in their benefit cost tool environmental benefits. And this is just associated with flood, but that was specific to if you were to acquire some homes, remove them out of the floodplain and let it restore to that value, you could account for that environmental benefit in that benefit cost analysis. And so since then, lots of things have happened that I always want to communicate in these kind of talks. There's the introduction of ecosystem services into the PDM and HMA grants using the BCA tool. That's what I'm talking about now. So they're pre-disaster mitigation. And essentially I call it post-disaster mitigation grants. Only a few years later, FEMA created a climate resilient mitigation activities. And so that brought in water storage. So then we can start talking about water supply as an ecosystem service value. And again, applicable if you're doing a project that results in water storage. Say you're converting impervious surfaces to something else, you can account for the water storage and there's ways of deriving a value with that. And 1 year later, because of this classification of those activities, drought and wildfire protection were brought in. And so I've done work in, say, the state of Idaho, where we're looking at severe pest and wildfire risk areas. And so some of the mitigation activities they're doing there, AKA not only something like controlled burning, but also thinning, among other activities, can then be applicable to FEMA BCA tool and thus the grant programs. And finally, in 2013, they made a more robust matrix within the BCA tool. So you could talk about wetlands, you could talk about grasslands, forest, you could talk about the benefits of post-disaster mitigation activities or mitigation activities in general. Those land cover types that are being converted as a result of the project, you can put that into the FEMA BCA tool when you're applying for the project, and it accounts toward the benefit side. So that when the costs is all the investments we're doing on the ground work, the benefit is those environmental benefits to make that benefit cost ratio rise up to the threshold we're looking for. So some examples of this happening recently. So the city of Snohomish, working with the Snohomish Conservation District, use the PDM granting cycle to focus on shoreline flood and groundwater resilience, and we're able to successfully obtain a grant. There's water restoration and flood planning in King County, working with the Conservation District to target both HMGP and PDM programs as well. We were fortunate enough to, in the Santa Cruz case, to work with these organizations and the Coastal San Luis Resource Conservation District to focus on wildfire fuel reductions and their applicability to those grants. And then finally, multi-jurisdiction hazard mitigation in Washington County in partnering with multiple water districts. So again, when we're able to collaborate with organizations, we can use a lot of the economic tools that we've have our hands on, or that are even just out there in the world free, to go into this FEMA grant application go into their benefit cost analysis tool to then help that application process. That was our goal. So my last slide, just other applications of like what we call the ecosystem service framework, or measuring the dollar value of a lot of different ecosystem services. So think of all those icons I showed in that tool before. Thinking of forests, say, or other wetlands as assets. So we can begin to talk through the portfolio conversations, the operating budgets, the capital investments, and those 5-year cycles and plannings, so that we can start not focusing solely on gray infrastructure, but bringing in the green infrastructure as well to that conversation, because they serve the same benefits as a lot of our gray infrastructure. We've seen ample opportunity in risk modeling, and that's pretty obvious from the disaster mitigation perspective, but it's really only focused on the flooding perspective. But when we're looking at, say, wildfire, we've been doing a lot of work in Idaho and California, and we're seeing that maintaining forests as assets in specific ways reduces risk associated with this effort, and allows you to target better projects and a reduction in the risks. And then finally, some interesting applications of our program. We've been looking into the benefits of compost application. We work with King County to understand what it means to invest in a capital project that would allow them to have a Class A compost program, so that they can have that accessible to the community. So AKA, what are the benefits of applying compost in certain conditions? What does that mean for stormwater application, for just the resulting habitat, depending on the type of application? We're even looking at working forests and spraying certain types of biosolids out there, and we're going out there and taking data and measuring the environmental benefits associated with the conditions that result. So given the amount of time, I'll skip this last bullet, just leave some time for questions, and just want to say thank you. And I don't have my information here, but I'll pop it in the chat just now. So appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really great. I love the slide with the examples from the conservation districts and sort of FEMA or hazard mitigation grants. I'm just wondering if you might step back just a little bit, just in case there's people on the webinar that don't know exactly how the cost benefit analysis figures into getting those hazard mitigation grants or the pre-disaster mitigation grant.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the very initial examples where in the case of, say, there was a flood mitigation project and you're applying for a pre-disaster mitigation grant, and part of that project is to acquire homes. And before the environmental benefits were associated, the benefits were just the avoided costs of being flooded and flooded and flooded again. So now with the environmental benefits included in their benefit cost ratio, you can actually, once the homes are removed, you can define a scenario where, okay, we're going to let this area restore to some native wetland, grassland, and forest type. And in the back end, in FEMA's tool, you can actually select the ecosystem services that result as a result of the restoration, and those benefits, say the stormwater benefit attributed to forests and grasslands, the annual value, and it goes on the benefit side of that calculation. So the cost of acquiring homes, the benefits of not flooding homes anymore, plus those environmental benefits. And so, I mean, I think the standard criteria is you have to get above a 1.0 threshold, so more benefits than costs. But in projects like these, FEMA is now allowing projects to pass and receive grant funding if they only received a 0.75. So that means a 3 to 4 ratio before the environmental benefits came in, because they knew the environmental benefits were going to account for the rest of that. So it really is a game changer for that application process.
Super helpful. Thank you for doing that. So we do have a few minutes for questions, and Sarah, are you going to spotlight everyone so that we can do those? I wanted to start with one that's in the Q&A box, and it's because I think it's sort of like a communications question really in the end. And I think we've done a good job today of showing the benefits and all of the possibilities when we have these partnerships built with not conservation districts or other kinds of districts and the hazard mitigation planning process. But how do we, I guess I sort of want to turn this question into a communications question. And the question was about how we use past events to emphasize, how critical mitigation planning is before we get to the emergency situation. So how do we communicate the benefits, or how do we communicate to the public, to decision makers, about the importance of being proactive about mitigation planning. And then I'm going to also add to that, how do we communicate about the importance of these natural resources as part of that proactive effort to mitigate a future disaster. So I'm going to throw that out there, and whoever wants to start, maybe Matt.
So I'll use an example from here in Colorado. I think most folks out there have probably heard of the Marshall Fire, which was in I believe 2019, 2020. I actually think it was 2020 before I moved to the state. It was in Boulder County, extended quite a ways into out of the wildland urban interface, the WUI, and into quite a few incorporated communities in that area. And I think it was 2018, Boulder updated their hazard mitigation plan, and the burn scar was almost spelled out in that hazard mitigation plan. So through no fault of their, not saying anybody was wrong or anything like that, but policy decisions and in Boulder County, they didn't. Well, I don't want to get into what Boulder County did or didn't do, but it was laid out, and there were mitigation actions in that plan that could have maybe lightened the impact or even prevented it from happening.
Yeah. Similarly, I've worked, so a more recent project was in Idaho, and I think any state in the West will have examples of, say, a pretty severe fire in their recent past. And so we worked with the state jurisdictions in understanding, okay, what does high severity fire mean and the costs associated with that? What were downstream dredging costs like? What was the rehabilitation from a habitat perspective? What was recreation access look like? So we can measure the costs associated with what high severity fire means. While fire is good, high severity fire can be very impactful when it burns down in the soil so much. And so then they used the best data that they had available to understand the risks associated with where are pests creating high severity infestation risk and where is another high severity fire most likely. And they had risk maps to help us with that process. So now we're running scenarios. We're seeing similar costs here. This is what playing out a scenario could look like elsewhere, especially in focusing on either communities that are underrepresented or communities with more affluence. Like there's more damage, there's more property, but there's more impact to people who may not have access to resources as well. So that was a part of our equation in looking at those.
And then bringing those economic data to the decision maker, like that helps sort of back up, the decision. Thoughts, Gabe and Brad?
I guess the only thing I would add is just being involved. I mean, the big takeaway from me getting involved with this group and hazard mitigation planning group is how important the ecological story is to all of these hazard mitigations and planning, and specifically when we're dealing with redevelopment situations. So we had this at least in the Midwest, we had this land use come through, which changed the ecological function, and specific to flooding. As we redevelop and start putting different resources, assets, societal assets, we need to have ecologists at the table, as well as other society members saying, hey, is this really where we want to place these assets? So that we don't have future costs, downstream costs, and impact future generations.
I think the one thing that I'd like to add is at a hyper local level, the importance of public outreach and making sure you're using multimodal approaches to reach out to your constituents and people in the area. I use everything from knocking on doors, public meetings. I've created websites. We have a section of our website that's dedicated to the ecological restoration work we're doing and linking it to those ecosystem service benefits, because they're not always a direct link or a direct line for the general public. So sometimes you have to work on connecting those dots for them to really show the importance, to go off of what Zach was saying of, finding those funding mechanisms. Having that outreach and education is really important to get the public on board with a lot of that, especially in the Midwest.
Yeah, totally agreed. And there's Calvert County in Maryland has as another really good example of how they're trying to use multimodal communication and outreach techniques. They have some really great YouTube videos. I think they're on YouTube. Journey's going to try to see if she can find the link, but they're really trying to get bite-sized important information out to the community on these exact issues. So I encourage you to check out also what they're doing. I know we're like right at the end, but we have some more questions. And I should have maybe reversed my question, but I'm just wondering, we talked about planning, we talked about project implementation, and I'm just wondering if maybe there's a few like of the big challenges that you might want to throw out there. I mean, one might be permitting, and is it harder to get these kind of projects permitted than maybe like a gray infrastructure project? And then the other, which has come up a bunch of times, is just getting, willing landowners. And sometimes I know, Gabe, you have to like cobble together those landowners before you can even start to think about the project. So maybe you can comment on that. What are some of those challenges? How are you trying to overcome those?
Well, that's why I think it was important to have both the conservation district story, my story, as well as Brad's, because the conservation district's approach is unique, and Brad's is probably more applicable to the entire nation because they're really getting ahead of the development and the development planning. But from our standpoint, again, with our mission, ecological focus, we are taking a look at systems, and we want to restore systems. So we'll actually go in and preserve the entire watershed before we do these ecological restoration projects. And as I mentioned, we just completed that phase 5 because we didn't have the proper land holdings in order to do that. So this long-term approach is very important.
Other thoughts? No. Well, we are, I don't want to cut anyone off, but I know we are at the end of our time, and I would really appreciate all these presentations, all the information, the highlighting what the special districts can do and how they play an important role and the benefits they can bring to the hazard mitigation planning process. We'll have some more information that will be available on this project, specifically trying to build partnerships around hazard mitigation planning with conservation districts. We have some case studies that are going to come out, including McHenry County soon, and a couple of other resources that we're going to be posting on our website. We're not quite ready, but we will reach out when we are ready and provide you with those resources. And thank you again to the panel. Thank you for joining us in Journey. I'm going to turn it to you.
Yeah, I also just want to give a final thank you to all of our wonderful speakers today, Rebecca, Matthew, Gabe, Brad, Zachary. We really appreciate each of you taking the time to discuss this important topic. And a big thank you as well to our audience for tuning in. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this program was recorded, and the recording will be publicly available on ELI's website within just a few business days. I do just want to note that programs like these are made possible with the support of ELI members, so members can attend exclusive member webinars and also have access to a lot of other benefits, such as our webinar archive, weekly newsletter, publications, and so much more. So if you're not already an ELI member, we do encourage you to visit eli.org to join. Thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.